Welcome to the first lecture in the semester-long series of lectures for Introductory Biology Cells, Biology 2010. What I typically like to do with my very first lecture is give a little bit of an overview of things to come and basically just a general introduction to the topic. So the first place that I usually start for this particular course is to talk a little bit about what biology is. Hopefully, you're familiar with the concept that biology is defined as the study of life. So when we talk about the study of life, what we're really referring to is a scientific study of life. So briefly, when we talk about science, the word science itself comes from the Latin to know. So what we're talking about or referring to when we discuss science is the ability to build and organize knowledge by asking questions and trying or attempting to answer those questions. So then, if we add to that this is the scientific study of life, the next question should be, what exactly is life? And this is sometimes hard to define, and we will attempt to do so, but first we have to realize that life is structured on a size scale ranging from the molecular to the global, and we'll touch on that today. Also, biology scope stretches across enormous diversity of life on Earth, and again, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So back to the question, what is life? Well, there are several properties that are associated with living organisms, and what we're going to do now in the next set of slides is discuss what those properties are and why they are important to consider as parts or properties of life. The first one, depicted in panel A of this particular figure, is order. When we talk about order, what we're referring to is that all living things exhibit complex but ordered organization. So the pine cone in this particular example is a great example of order overall. So the first property of life is order, that all living things exhibit complex but ordered organization. The next property of life is regulation. When we talk about regulation, what we're referring to is a living organism has the ability to adjust to its environment, that is within limits, and is able to maintain a stable internal environment. So in the figure that you see here in panel B for regulation, you can see that this lizard is sitting on top of a rock and it is absorbing solar energy to help regulate or maintain its internal environment. Again, regulation is a property of life. The next property of life is growth and development. With growth and development, what we're referring to takes a few steps back to talk a little bit about the fact that information is carried by genes, and this information controls the growth and development of a living organism. So the ability to grow and develop is also a property of life. The last figure on this particular slide is panel D, and that refers to energy utilization. Energy utilization is the need to take in energy to perform life's different and vast types of activities. In this particular example, you have a puffin that is obtaining energy from the fish that it's caught. It converts that energy from the fish as a food or fuel source and uses that energy to then be able to swim. So living organisms have as a property of life the ability to utilize energy. The next property of life is the ability to respond to the environment. That is, living organisms are able to detect environmental stimuli and respond in some particular way. So in this particular example, you have a Venus flytrap that is able to respond to or detect the dragonfly that has landed there, be able to close up, and then Add to that some of the properties we just discussed, such as energy utilization. So, the ability to respond to the environment, specifically to environmental stimuli, is in fact a property of life. Next, we have reproduction. This one is pretty straightforward. Living organisms have the ability to make more of the same type of living organisms. And then lastly, evolution. Evolution is the capacity for populations to change over time, and this too is a very clear and distinct property of life. So in order for an organism to be considered living, the properties that we just talked about need to be met, again, in order to be considered a living organism. Now, as you can imagine, biology is in fact a very diverse field. Biologists, those individuals that study biology, explore life at levels that range from the biosphere to molecules that make up a cell. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the characteristics on this particular slide in a little more detail. Because again, biologists could be interested in studying any one or several of the aspects that you see on this particular slide. So starting up at the top with number 1, what some scientists or some biologists are interested in is studying the biosphere. And this is really a global level scale of study. It is focused on all of the environments on Earth that support life. So you may be a scientist or a biologist that's interested in studying this global aspect of the biosphere. Taking it sort of down a notch is the level of the ecosystem. The ecosystem is defined as all organisms living in a particular area, also the non-living physical components which affect that or those organisms living in that area. Things such as water, air, soil, sunlight, etc. So some biologists are interested in studying the ecosystem, how all of the organisms in a particular area interact with each other as well as their environment. The next level biologists might be interested in is the community level of organization. With a community, what we're referring to are living organisms within an ecosystem. So this is really just the living organisms in the ecosystem that a biologist might be interested in, and not necessarily the physical components that could affect those organisms. The next level down is what we refer to as populations. Some biologists are interested in focusing on population level studies. This consists of interacting individuals of one species. Now we're honing in on one particular species in a community and studying the interactions of those individuals in that particular species. Finally, for this first half of the slide, you have right at the center the individual organism. Some biologists are focused on individual organisms in a population. So continuing on from that central point in the slide where you have the organism itself, we can focus as biologists on different aspects within an individual organism. At the heart of that, at point number 8, which is totally at the bottom of the slide, are cells. This course is Introductory Biology Cells, and of course that's what we're going to be focusing on for the entire semester. The cell is the smallest unit that can display all characteristics of life. So yes, we are going to focus on the cell itself, but what I want to do is sort of work our way backwards towards the organism for now, just to discuss some other aspects that biologists might be interested in. Tissues is one level up from cells, and this is a group of similar cells performing a specific function. When you have several tissues coming together, what you have is a type of organ. So some biologists may be interested in studying tissues, others may be interested in studying tissues that come together to form an organ, or organ systems. So organ, again, is a collection of tissues that are joined together to act as a unit to serve some common function. And an organ system is two or more organs that come together in a way, again, to interact. So an example of an organ might be the heart, whereas an organ system is going to include the circulatory system, the heart, the blood vessels, all of the things that are coming together as part of a system there. Okay, so now working our way back from cells down to even smaller components that biologists might be interested in. Within cells are organelles, and organelles are components of a cell with specialized function inside of the cell. So as you can imagine, in a cell biology course, we will be talking about organelles. We will also focus on molecules. Molecules are more than one type of atom that are chemically linked, and these are things that you would definitely find within a cell. And then the atom is the smallest chemical unit. We're going to talk a little bit about atoms, but our course is mostly going to focus on molecules, organelles, and cells overall. And at the very end of this lecture, I'll give you an overview of some of the topics that are going to be coming down the pipeline throughout the semester. So at the beginning of this lecture, not only did I state that life is structured on a size scale ranging from the molecular to the global, which is sort of what we just overviewed in the past two slides. I also mentioned, though, at the beginning of the lecture, that biology's scope stretches across enormous diversity of life on Earth, and that's what I'm going to address now for just a little bit. Diversity is, in fact, the hallmark of life. When we talk about diversity, what we mean is all of the different types of organisms that we know or predict to live on Earth. So when we talk about diversity, we know that diversity typically is known to include about 1.8 million species. However, this might be a little outdated, and the number is somewhere around 2 million different and distinct type of species that have been identified. The estimates overall of total diversity are actually much larger, somewhere in the range of 10 million to over 100 million species. That's taking into account the species that we have yet to identify. So when we talk about known life, with that 1.8 to 2 million species number, what we're referring to is those that have been identified and named overall. So just to give you a little bit of an example, there are approximately 300,000 different plant species that have been identified and named. There are somewhere around 50,000 different vertebrate species. These are animals that have backbones. Interestingly, there are greater than 1 million different insect species that have been identified. That's a pretty big number overall if you think about the amount of diversity that I just mentioned in that 1.8 to 2 million species that have been identified. Another sort of interesting tidbit or fact is that greater than 99% of organisms that have lived on Earth are now extinct. So that is also maybe a fuel for thought. So because we are dealing with such a vast amount of diversity, the number of species is seemingly overwhelming to us when we talk about something like 2 million different species that have been identified. One concept that will come up over and over again throughout the semester is that what scientists and biologists in particular like to do is that when there's a lot of information, how do we deal with all of that information? The best way to deal with it is to categorize it into smaller groups. So then rather than having this very large number, we can now focus on categories where things might make sense to be grouped together. And taxonomy is in fact the branch of biology that names and classifies species. And so what we're going to do is spend just a little bit of time here talking about what's referred to as the 3 domains of life, and then a little breakdown from that point on. There are 3 domains of life that have been categorized, and those domains of life are known as bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now, the way that these domains have been put together is basically from a single concept of what type of cells are found in those organisms or species. We will talk about different types of cells in subsequent lectures, but hopefully this refreshes your memory just a little bit to maybe high school biology, in that there are 2 broad categories of cell types. There are cells that are considered prokaryotes, and there are cells that are considered eukaryotes. The basic distinguishing characteristic of prokaryotes from eukaryotes is that eukaryotes have structured components referred to as organelles that have specialized function within the cell, whereas prokaryotes lack these specialized structures. It doesn't mean that prokaryotes can't do a whole range of different types of activities and processes, physiological aspects. It just means that there are not distinct specialized structures like we see in eukaryotes for certain functions. So that's the first type of division with all of this diversity, is what type of cells make up those organisms. Are they prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells? So from that point on is where the 3 domains come into play. Bacteria and archaea are both domains of life composed of single-celled organisms that are prokaryotes or prokaryotic cells. Bacteria most commonly are things that you might know as pathogenic organisms. However, we know that there are plenty of bacteria that even are inside of us as humans that are beneficial and are considered good overall. Archaea is also a diverse group. There are things that are known as methanogens, which metabolize hydrogen and carbon dioxide into methane. There are halophiles, which thrive in a heavy salt environment. There are thermophiles that live in very extreme hot temperature conditions. Archaea is also a type of single-celled organism that is prokaryotic. So both bacteria and archaea are single-celled prokaryotic organisms. Eukarya is a domain that is made up entirely of cells or cell types that are referred to as eukaryotic or eukaryotes. Eukarya is also extremely diverse, and oftentimes we break that up into different kingdoms. There is the kingdoms that you might typically think of or are familiar with. Plantae, which includes your plants. Fungi, which include funguses and molds and things like that. Animalia, which include animals. And protists, which are a little different category, are single-celled eukaryotic organisms, and these are things like red algae, diatoms, amoeba that you might be familiar with, plasmodium, which is the parasite that causes malaria, is also in this particular category. So, as you can see, again, there is quite a bit of diversity, and one way to deal with that diversity is to begin some level of categorization. Now we come to the point when in a typical face-to-face type of class, I would open it up for a little bit of discussion. And what I usually like to do is throw out the broad question, what do you think we're going to study in this course over the semester? The obvious answer is cells, right? Because that's in the title of the course name, Introductory Biology, Cells. But interestingly, it doesn't just stop there. there are a lot of different aspects and facets that we are going to focus on throughout the entire semester. The place that we actually need to start, and where our first true full lecture will begin, is dealing with the building blocks of life. What we have to do is understand a little bit first about the scientific process, which we'll get a little taste of that in the lab section, and we'll talk a little bit about in the lecture as well. But as far as building blocks are concerned, to build a cell, we need to talk about some basic cellular chemistry. In order to do that, we have to talk about atoms, how atoms interact to form molecules, then talk about some basic molecules such as water, and then move on to a category of molecules known as macromolecules. And these are very important for cellular function and structure overall. So again, we're going to do this building block section first. From there, we'll move on to what I think students typically imagine when they think about a cell biology course, are sort of the pieces and parts of a cell. What makes up a cell membrane, the structures found inside of the cell, that type of thing. And absolutely, we will move on to talking about structural characteristics of cells. From there, we will then begin to move on to function and processes, physiological functions that cells participate in. There are some common aspects, such as talking about metabolism. We're going to talk a little bit about enzymes and how enzymes function. We will definitely talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and we will also discuss cell division overall. So again, these are topics under what I consider physiological processes, functions, things that cells do. Lastly, what we will focus on is genetics. Now with genetics, what we're going to do is talk about some basic transmission genetics. How do traits get passed on from one generation to the next? But really what we're going to focus on again is at the cellular level, understanding what happens with cells and their genetic material, and how that genetic material contains all of the instructions for a cell to be able to function and survive. And that too is a large unit of material that we will focus on. So as you can see, we will talk about several different main themes or umbrellas with specific topics underneath those umbrellas throughout the semester. Hopefully you will learn a lot from this particular course and enjoy the lectures that I will be providing for you. With that, I will leave an end to today's lecture and come back and check in for the next lecture.